In the War of Independence, the French Revolution, and the Civil War, soldiers gladly and proudly put their lives on the line to ensure the liberties of the people. Because we believe that individual liberty is the very thread that forms a nation, we strongly affirm the resolution. Individual liberties are more important than national security. Now, before I move on to my contentions, I'd like to clarify a few key terms in the resolution. Individual liberty are the rights that are designated to an individual that belong to that person alone. In this round, we'll focus on the right to life, which is the most fundamental individual liberty that can be provided. More important, notice that this debate will be based on the values of international liberty, of individual liberty and national security. The next definition I'll define is national security, which is the idea of protecting a country based on preemption, prevention, or self-defense. Now, moving on to my first contention, individual liberties are precedent to national security. The only reason governments were created in the first place was to ensure the protection of individual liberties. The only reason we have national security is to ensure the freedoms that each individual has, the freedom to live. We can see this example in the social contract, the contract that binds the people and the government together, in which the people give up certain rights in order to receive protection from the government, and that protection is the right to life. And therefore, again, we see that the very thread that holds a people and its government together, that builds a nation together, is individual liberties. Again, we wouldn't have national security if we had nothing to protect. We value national security because we have individual liberty, and therefore, because this is what makes up national security, that is why individual liberties must be held as more important than national security. Our second contention is that history shows promoting nationalism above international liberties provides security for no one. Now, we're not saying that national security isn't important, but the fact is you can't have national security without individual liberties, which is what national security was made to protect in the first place. Again, you can look to regimes in history, such as Hitler, or Cuba, or North Korea, in which they hold the rights of the community and national security over individual liberties. And in doing so, they undermine the value of individual liberties and they forget why they have to protect national security in the first place. Furthermore, the benchmark for national security, again, is individual liberties. The only way we can measure what national security is or how effective it is in terms of how many individual liberties that are able to be protected. Again, life without liberty is not a life worth living. Now, our final contention is that if there are no limits to what we will give up in the name of national security, then the value of what our country stands for is worthless. Now, we can look back to the past resolution that we had in today's round. My opponents believe that individual liberties are less important than national security. Then what limits do they uphold? For example, in today's debate on torture, if non-lethal forms of torture don't work, do we then go on and violate more liberties and then sanction and graduate to harsher forms of torture, such as sexual assault or the breaking of limbs, as we did in the Middle Ages and in World War II? Let us now say that even harsher forms of torture do not work. However, we know torturing the suspect's family might get accused to break down and give us information we need. Do we then torture the suspect's family at the possibility that it may save the lives of those in danger? Most will say that both of these scenarios posed are unacceptable and immoral because there are, in fact, limits to which a government should go in the name of national security. And the limits, we know what the limits are based on the violations of individual liberties. You cannot have national security without first enforcing the rights of individuals, their right to life, and their freedom to live a quality life. And again, we see, going back to history, the fact that regimes that value national security over individual freedoms have actually gone on a tangent in terms of protecting what their country should value most, which is the lives of their people. The only reason this idea of national security came up in the first place was because we needed to ensure the protections of the people. The entire reason why governments were created in the first place, the whole reason why we have a social contract, why we have a contract that binds the people and the government together, is because we value life and because we value the liberties that each individual ought to have. And because the one thing that we want to achieve in this round is the freedom to live, which is individual liberty. We see that national security is only a tool that allows us to reach that goal. And for this reason, that is why we hold individual liberties as more important than national security. Again, we are not saying that national security is not important, but rather what we are saying is that in order to have national security, you have to first make sure that you are taking the measures necessary to ensure the right to life, the right to freedom of individuals in a country. And for this reason, because we value what national security was built to protect, we affirm the resolution, individual liberties are more important than national security.
Do you believe that rights are absolute?
Rights are absolute, yes.
So, do you think that the right to life is absolute?
Well, again, in order to,
Wait. So yes, it is.
Yeah.
So if if a criminal is holding a gun to my head, I can't shoot him back.
Not necessarily, because at that point, because we value individual liberties, because that person who put that gun to your head first violated your right to life, your individual freedom to do what you want and to live a quality life.
So when I go against the rights of others,
yes.
my right isn't absolute.
Yes.
Contradicting what you said before when I asked you a question about rights being absolute.
Rights are absolute until the moment you violate the rights of other individuals.
So rights aren't absolute.
They are, but in the cases where you violate another individual's rights.
So when I talked about the criminal situation when I was taken hostage, that was an act of self-defense, was it not?
Yes, it was.
Then wasn't part of her definition of national security an act of self-defense for the country?
Yes, but the reason why we have national security, the idea that we need to protect enforce self-defense is because we value individual liberty, the right to life, the right to freedom, and so on.
So now you change your stance and said that rights aren't absolute. So to what extent are rights absolute and what extent are rights not absolute?
The rights are absolute until the point where you violate another individual's rights.
So let's say if a terrorist comes
Yes.
and violates the lives of many people,
Yes.
we have the right to violate his rights.
Yes.
So isn't that also part of national security?
Again, what national security is based off of is the fact that that terrorist violated the rights of thousands of innocent people, their right to freedom. Therefore, we see that because we value the rights of these thousands of innocent people, national security is a tool that we use to enforce these individual liberties.
Could you hammer a nail to a wall if you have no hammer?
Again, without a nail, you wouldn't need a hammer.
Well, if you're dead, you have rights.
If you have dead, you have rights.
If you're dead, do you have rights?
You're not able to have rights.
So isn't
You're not physically.
the necessity of national security to protect civil liberties? Without national security, civil liberties won't exist at all.
You wouldn't need national security if you don't have something to protect.
Do you take drugs?
No.
Do you think we have the right to take drugs and do whatever you want?
Yes, it's my freedom of choice.
Why does the government not legalize it?
Because they're trying to enforce individual liberties. Perhaps if drugs have been proven to be harmful to our health, damaging, because they want to protect our individual liberty, our right to life, and the liberty to do what we want. If drugs were
So
prohibited
in this
from
case,
being
if you didn't have national security and if you allowed a lot of people to have drugs, then a lot of people's civil liberties are being destroyed.
Again, what your point is saying is that you need national security in order to make sure people don't sacrifice their right to life. The right to life, that's what you're trying to protect. Without the right to life, you wouldn't need national security.
So again, I'd like to clarify one more time. Are
Yes.
rights absolute or not?
They are absolute until you violate the rights of others.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, on the opposition side today, we realize that we have the unpopular side of this debate. We see that it's easy for someone to come up and say, our civil liberties are the most important things to us, that in a society, that's what's most important. However, on the opposition side, what we believe that realistically, that without national security, that these civil liberties cannot be protected in the first place. That in the real world, that national security precedes civil liberties. And for this reason, we believe that individual liberties national security is actually more important than individual liberties. Now, I'd like to today give our burden of proof. What we believe on the opposition side as our burden of proof is that we are not justifying the infringement of everyone's civil liberties. Now we see that if a government kills their people, if a person like Hitler unjustly kills their people, if North Korea, they capture them and detain the people for no reason, we do not believe that this is justified. However, on the opposition side, what we believe is that simply when national security and individual liberties are conflicting against each other and clashing against each other, that's when we choose national security. And this usually happens in countries where there are checks and balances, separation of power. That's where we see that these kinds of individual liberties, are able to be infringed. And it's not all individual liberties can be infringed anytime at all. Now I'd like to move on to our first, before I move on to our first 2 points, I'd like to rebut against the proposition case. Now the first reason is that their first argument is that the reason for government is to actually protect these individual liberties. And on the opposition side, we do not actually rebut against these points. We're not saying that individual liberties need to be protected. However, what we do believe is that national security, in realistic terms, when we have to choose one or the other, that we should be choosing national security simply because of the fact that without national security, we can't actually protect these individual liberties. And I'll continue to explain these as my points. Now, secondly, they talked about history. They said that, throughout history, when nationalism was put before liberties, that this actually caused a lot of problems. They gave examples of Hitler and North Korea. However, we do not, as we said, we do not believe that these are justified. We do not believe that when the North Korean government captures their people and tortures them without any reason, we believe that this is not justified. However, we believe that if, in case of America, for example, if they were to actually have their national liberties or their national security, if they had to choose between these two, we believe that they should be choosing national security. And thirdly, they talked about they asked what limits do we put to ourselves when we actually do this. They said there are no limits when we actually continue to do this. However, we believe that there is a limit. However, they talked about how they actually said, when do we stop torturing people? And then again, during their cross-examination, they said, if this criminal actually does infringe upon the rights of others, then we should torture them. And we believe that this is an extreme contradiction on their side, that they're saying, we shouldn't torture people because their individual liberties are more important. But the individual liberties of criminals are not important, somehow because these rights are absolute, not absolute. And we're saying that, we see that on the proposition side, though they're not explicitly saying it, they're basically saying that these rights are not absolute for these people. Now, I'd like to next move on to our own arguments. First of all, which is the national security precedes individual liberties, and secondly, how rights are not absolute. Now, firstly, how national security precedes individual liberties. Now, we see that security of the country is the basis of this government, is the bedrock of society. Now, we see that protecting the country's security is necessary to be able to protect the civil liberties. Now, we see that civil liberties are just a piece of paper. It's an abstract idea until we have the national security to actually use this protection. Now, we say if there's no national security, there are no civil rights. For example, in the case of America, in their history, when they actually started the American Revolution, obviously their ideals to fight against Britain was to actually have their individual liberties. However, we believe is that they had to ensure the national security. They had to ensure that Britain wasn't in their country. They had to ensure that their country was nationally secure, that their people were safe in their beds. They had to fight this war before they actually were able to write a constitution to actually have these civil liberties. And we see that in the hierarchy of rights, we believe that this national security, this right to life, because we believe that the national security does actually affirm the right to life, for this reason we believe that national security comes first. And next, I'd like to move on to our second point. And before I say that, we believe that they said that, without civil liberties, then national security is not able. However, let's think about it like this. We have just civil liberties, but we don't have national security. We believe that in this case, civil liberties cannot be protected. Now, secondly, to move on to my second point about how rights are not absolute. Now, we say that no right of every single person is absolute at all times. We believe that these civil liberties are important, but we believe that these are not absolute. Now, let's for example, talk about the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Article 29, Section 2 talks about how if one person's rights are being infringed, then you can infringe that on that. If a person is infringing the rights of another person, then we can infringe that person's rights. And the proposition has also conceded to this point. And for this reason, we see that the rights of every single person is not actually absolute. We talked about self-defense, ladies and gentlemen. Although we believe that the right to life is extremely important and should be absolute at most times, that we can actually infringe upon this right, that we can take away this individual liberty when they're actually compromising the national security. We also see, for example, the army draft or military or required military service. For example, we see that all South Korean men are required to actually be to serve 2 years of military. And although this may be an infringement of their rights, we see that this is actually helpful towards the national security of South Korea. We also see, for example, airport security. They take full body scans of your naked body. But we believe that this is actually justifiable in this case when the national security of the government is compromised. And for this reason, we believe that individual liberties are not more important than national security, but however it's the opposite way around. Thank you.
You want to run?
Is everyone ready? Thank you for your speech. I have a couple of questions I'd like to address. First, let's talk about your burden. What is the burden for the negative?
We believe that the burden is that we're not actually justifying all infringements upon people's civil liberties, but in the case when national security is in direct conflict.
Why would you have to justify that at all times national security is more important than individual liberty?
We're saying that yes, in cases where national security is conflicting with individual liberties, that's when we should choose national security.
So in all situations where national security conflicts with individual liberty, you think that we have to go to national liberty?
No, we see that there are governments who actually claim that national security.
No, I'm not talking about governments or realistic growth. You're saying that your burden is to prove that whenever there's a conflict between national security and individual liberty, you have to look towards national security.
No, we
correct?
believe that it depends per case.
So you don't have to prove that? Then what is your burden?
No, we believe that, as we said, when there is an actual legitimate reason for this national
So when
security.
there's a legitimate conflict between national security and individual liberty, you have to prove that we have to go towards national security,
Yes.
right? Awesome. Now, you said that, okay, actually, is national security absolute?
Yes, we believe that national security of a country is
So there's no time when national security is compromised.
Well, there obviously are situations.
So national security is absolute?
No, yes, it's absolute, but it's times where there are compromise, and that's why we need to actually
Now,
protect.
didn't you blame my partner Linda for being contradictory because she said the exact same thing about individual liberties?
No. What we're saying is that national security is absolute. When it's compromised by other people,
So when it's compromised by other nations, you can violate other people's national security, right? So if the U.S. declares war on Mexico, then Mexico has the right to fight that, correct?
Yes.
Awesome. You said that Korean men are drafted to the army, right? Why?
We believe that because South Korea is currently in still a state with conflict with North Korea,
Right.
and we see that the government is continuing to actually make sure that these people are be able to go into war at any time.
So we're getting ready for war.
We're not getting ready for war, we're just doing it as a
Okay, so
precautionary
we're trying to
measure.
protect national security, right?
Yes.
Why?
Because we believe that if North Korea were to actually attack South Korea, and then there are no soldiers, and not all the people were ready, then we believe that this would actually harm South Korea, and then it would actually.
So no, but if North Korea invades South Korea, what's being violated in South Korea?
Their national security.
Do you think individual lives might be compromised?
Of course, but we believe that national security is the whole concept that actually affirms their right to live.
So national security is affirming the right to live.
Yes.
So what's the difference between the right to live and national security?
We believe that we believe that when individual liberties, there are many other rights that.
But is the right to life a part of national security then?
Yes.
So are we allowed to defend the right to life then?
Yes.
So it can be our burden to prove that the right to life is more important than national security when national security is the right to life?
No. We believe that, as you said, you gave other examples of individual liberties.
Okay.
We believe that national security of a country actually is the way to affirm the right to life.
All right, got it. Thank you very much.
You guys like more prep time?
Yes, please.
Are we all ready? Okay. First, as we saw from the first two speeches on the cross-examination, it's pretty evident that one thing isn't more important than the other, or one thing isn't not important. In other words, national security isn't not important, but what we have to prove as the affirmative side is basically in this chicken and egg debate that if the chicken can't hatch eggs, there's no recreation, no more rights to protect. It's a bad analogy, but you get the point. We're going to go on to the definitions debate, or not really a debate because they conceded most of the things we said. We define national security as the idea of prevention, self-defense, and preemptions, or any policies designed to do that. This includes countries who believe that their national security is at risk and will act in accordance to what they believe is going to be national security risk. So if North Korea believes that South Korea is posing a national security threat and decides to create nuclear weapons, that is an act of national security by limiting the rights they have by being a total dictatorship in North Korea. And that's something that they didn't address because they never refuted the idea of our national security definition. So now moving on to their burden of proofs. They said that we're not justifying infringement on innocent lives. But what you have to realize is regardless of whether you want to or not, if you want to ensure national security, sometimes innocent people's lives and innocent people's liberties will be compromised. It doesn't matter if you don't want to prove it, but you have to in this case. Because national security, for example, we all give up some of the liberties after 9/11 with the airport security. Those types of things include innocent people and the rights that innocent people have and the liberties they have. So whatever burden of proof they decide they want to show doesn't really matter as long as if they can't show that national security as a whole is not more important than individual rights, you should still vote for the affirmative side today. The second point, or the first point, oh yes, so going on to their first point, they said that national security precedes individual rights, which again are individual liberties, which again is just a direct contradiction to our first point, which we said that individual rights are more important than national security. All you need to look at is what comes first, or what can't continue without the other. The thing that espouses national security, as we outlined in the first contention that they did not address, is the fact that we voluntarily give up some of our rights to create the government in order to ensure the national security, to protect the rights that we have. In other words, if we didn't believe in our individual liberties, there would be no national security in the first place. We wouldn't want the government to exist if we didn't want the government to protect the liberties that some of the liberties we decide to give up. So again, we can see that this just proves that individual rights does in fact precede national security. Another thing they said is about the Britain example, how the US declared war, but first they had to see if any British people are actually in the United States or something. No, we in the United States sent King George III a letter saying, go away, stop harassing us, give us our individual liberties, and we declared war. And then we said, after that, we were basically able to establish the foundation and the principles of the United States of America, which is again based on individual liberties, instead, that is more important than national security. Their second point is the fact that rights are not absolute. We found that in the cross-examination that quite evidently, national security isn't right and quite absolute either. Sometimes you have to compromise innocent people's lives and innocent people's liberties. So again, it doesn't really matter if they're trying to say that rights are not absolute. We conceded to the fact that it's a social contract. If you stop acting like a human being, maybe you shouldn't be treated like one. But if you put national security first, look at all the other atrocities that happened. Again, Hitler's regimes, Cuba's regime, again, North Korea's regime. All of these things are the most extreme, all of these examples are the most extreme ends of what happens when national security becomes absolutely more important than individual liberties. Going on to our case, our first contention was that it precedes national security. They said we do not have to refute this. Okay, thank you very much. You can extend everything we said about how individual rights are actually more important than national security, and it precedes about how individual rights do exceed national security. And she said that it's not it's one or the other. If it in the case is one or the other, national security actually comes first. But again, we mentioned the fact that people actually would rather, there are some people who would actually rather die instead of compromising their liberties. For example, Patrick Henry, one of the founding fathers of the United States of America, said, give me liberty or give me death. He would rather much have died under the regime of King George III, under this totalitarian regime, than to have for example, not have his liberties. So again, we see that there are people who much appreciate liberties over national security. So what does that say about national security? The second thing they didn't address is that we do not, again, I addressed this, they said that they don't believe it's justified, but again, if you're going to actually compromise the innocent people's liberties, and you're going to try to do some national security policy, again, you have to take that into consideration. And lastly, what they failed to mention is the fact that we do have limits of governments and where they can act. For example, we don't put everybody with AIDS on an island because it might compromise national security. We do have limits, and for these reasons, please affirm the resolution. Thank you.
What exactly is national security?
preemption in regards to policies enacted to protect people.
So you're saying that North Korea, if their idea of national security is to actually create a nuclear bomb, isn't that a problem with the government rather than the idea of national security?
Who creates the idea of national security? The governments do. So regardless of what your definition of national security is, there are in this world, as we were speaking of, we're talking about real world situations, we have governments that believe that some of these national security issues may be to do things like North Korea does.
But so you're saying you believe, you do realize, so are you conceding to the fact that some civil liberties need to be compromised to actually create national security?
We established that in our first case where we voluntarily give up some of our rights. For example, we can't run around and kill people. You wouldn't have the right to do that, right? Because we are civilized and we created a government to stop us from doing that because we want to protect our lives. If we didn't, if we just wanted to run around and kill people, why would we create a government to protect the rights of people?
So isn't that actually compromising someone's individual liberties?
Exactly, but if you don't have, again, the reason why we create the government is because we want to protect those individual liberties, but without the will of wanting to protect those liberties, we wouldn't have created the government in the first place. The government would not exist.
Okay, so isn't national security necessary to actually have this government, to protect civil liberties?
Sure, I mean, that's what I just said. Well, yeah, we gave up some of the rights, but we initially said that individual rights is what we want to protect. Without that idea, and the fact that this is more of an important issue, we wouldn't have created a government in the first place. So in this case, individual rights are more important. Otherwise, if we didn't care about what rights we protected, we wouldn't need the government.
No, like so you still talked about, during the American Revolution, so if they hadn't won this militarily, if they hadn't secured their national security, then how exactly would these civil liberties actually in any way be valid?
Sure, but why did we start the war in the first place? Because we believed that individual liberties were more important. That's what we're saying. In that case, we create the foundation for why we create the government. The government is useless without our desire to protect our rights. And without that idea, individual liberties wouldn't exist. And individual liberties is the exact same thing that creates the government.
So let's say we only had these individual liberties, but not the national security. Then wouldn't this show that
I established in my case that one can't exist without the other, but what I did prove is that without one, the other one right now wouldn't have existed.
No, isn't the same thing? So if you're saying that without national security there would be no civil liberties, then isn't that the exact same logic?
No, because I said if we hadn't believed that individual rights are more important, the government wouldn't exist. Right now, they work in conjunction, I guess, but without that initial desire, that initial will to want to protect our individual liberties and the fact that we consider it more important, we wouldn't have created the government.
Even with this actual...
Wait, you finish the question.
Is everyone ready? Now, ladies and gentlemen, what we see in today's debate is that it's not important which came first, individual liberties or national security. What we believe is which is more important is which ensures which. And side proposition in today's debate has been constantly bickering, saying, oh, individual liberties came first, that's why it's more important. That's not really important in today's debate. We're saying that national security exists and that ensures individual liberties. And that without national security, there's really nothing that we can do to protect these individual liberties. But side proposition in today's debate has been hiding behind this barrier saying, oh, since it came first, it must automatically be more important. We find that to be logically false in today's debate. And so in today's debate, we have to make sure that there are you have to understand that side proposition made some fundamental assumptions. First of all, they said that, the first assumption that they made was that they assumed that we have the burden of proof to prove that all individual liberties are infringed upon for national security. That's what we have to prove in today's debate. And we agree. But when we see that in the cases of North Korea, Cuba, and all these other regimes that actually were a big problematic problem for individual liberties, it wasn't because of the fact that national security itself was a problem, but because of these governments. We find that it's unfair for the side proposition to lay this burden on side proposition to prove and to justify these basically immoral and very detrimental regimes. And so we see that side proposition has been basically avoiding their burden, which was to show that in cases of when you have to choose one, individual liberties or national securities, they need to show that individual liberties go first. But as we see, side proposition has failed to prove that point. And so as the second speaker in today's debate, I'd like to do for you majorly two things. First of all, refute the arguments that side proposition has made, and then furthermore explore what they have talked about against our arguments. So let's first take a look at what they say. Now, basically, they talk about how, first of all, individual liberties basically lead to national security. Now, first of all, as I've already explained, this is not really important in today's debate. Which led to which is not important, but which ensures which is more important. And we have constantly proven in today's debate that national security indeed does secure these individual liberties. As we've shown you, yes, the example of American Revolution is a very good example. We see that the constitutional rights, or the Bill of Rights, all came before the American Revolution actually occurred. That's great, but if they didn't actually kick out the British, would any of that, with the Constitution, would the Bill of Rights mean anything? No, it would be just a fancy piece of writing that's in a museum. It would mean absolutely nothing, ladies and gentlemen. What we see is that because they actually took national security first, they were able to ensure the individual liberties of the American population, and we believe that is what is important in today's debate. And so that's why that first argument falls very quickly, and it's also very faulty in assumption that they think that which comes first is more important. Now let's explore the second argument that Tate talked about, of how basically there's this history of nationalism over identities, of basically individual liberties, and they find that to be clearly detrimental. Now, we believe that these are invalid cases, as we have already explained, because these regimes are inherently bad themselves. It wasn't the fact that national securities were bad, but that these regimes were bad in themselves. A more accurate representation of whether individual liberties become compromised because of national security would be asking ourselves about World War II. When the U.S. actually found out that Germany was beginning to take over all of their countries in Europe, did they say, oh, we're just going to let you go because we think it's not right for us to draft our soldiers? No, they said, okay, we're going to draft soldiers. We're going to stop this from happening because our national security is in threat. And so we see that World War II is a much better example. In fact, proposition has been giving us these faulty examples, which really shows no clear link between national security itself and the problems with individual liberties. Now, the final argument that they've talked about is how there are basically no limits, and basically how the value of the country is basically put into shambles if we actually enact what our side believes. But we believe that's not necessarily true either. As we've shown you, in democratic countries and democratic societies where checks and balances exist, for example, the United States, where they have a judicial system, the executive system, and also the legislative system, we actually see those countries do not really have a problem because they make these balances and they make these checks in order to make sure these policies of national security are not abused. And we've constantly given you examples of these infringements on human speech and also the freedom of basically going to the airport without getting your stuff checked, but it is now checked because of national security threats. Now let's take a look at what they basically said against our points. First of all, we said that national security is a necessary condition in order to protect individual liberties. But they basically avoided this point by saying, oh, this is contradictory to our first point. That does not give a proper refutation. I mean, what we have explained in this argument is not that national security came first, but is that national security is necessary in order to protect these civil liberties. And unless side proposition's third speaker comes up here and says, well, national security doesn't really ensure these individual liberties, then we find that side proposition has won this debate. And furthermore, on the second argument, they have talked about how, we have basically talked about how rights are not absolute. And they said that, yeah, it's not absolute because we gave up these rights. Precisely, ladies and gentlemen. What this shows is that people need to give up some of their individual liberties because they want to protect national security. Because in the end, national security is what protects these individual liberties. And that is why side opposition, in this debate definitely opposes today's motion. Thank you.
We'll take some time.
All right, you guys have
First question, does national security differ for various nations?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Does national security, this idea of prevention and taking measures such, do they differ for various nations?
National security, basically, we believe, is a protection of one's country. And when we say it differs, it's not because of the definition of national
I mean, like, in terms
security
of how we achieve national security, it's different for other nations, right?
based on the regime's belief.
Exactly. So how does the government check what is in the best interest in terms of national security? How does the government check what is in the best interest in terms of national security?
It's not really difficult if you protect a person.
So we protect the individual liberty, the right to life of the person.
Yes.
That is why we have
Protect
national
someone's
security.
life. That would indeed be national security.
Okay. So you do concede that individual liberties come before international security.
No, what we're saying is that national security ensures individual liberties.
But why do we have national security?
To protect individual liberties.
Okay, so therefore, individual liberties do come before national
But what
security.
this shows is that without national security, we have no individual liberties.
How do we ensure ensure, again, how, if a regime is doing what's in the best interest in terms of national security? How do we know that they're not going corrupt if the national security measures they're taking are
What
going
we've
astray?
shown constantly is that it's not the problem of national security itself, but these regimes, and it's very
Okay,
vital.
so why are these regimes bad?
Because they're corrupt.
What do they do?
They do bad things.
To people, so they violate the individual liberties of people.
But in this debate, we're not here to do, the burden on side opposition isn't to justify
So,
regimes
no,
and bad nations.
what I'm
We're here
going
to
at
justify
is, yes.
in basic generally, that national security is more important
Yes.
faced with the
I
choices of
understand.
individual liberties and national security.
But what I'm saying is, you're saying that these governments are corrupt, not because they didn't provide good national security, but because they violated individual freedoms.
No, just because they're inherently bad.
But why were these governments bad? Because of national security, or because they violated the right to life of
I'm
thousands
not
of
Kim Jong-il.
individuals?
I don't know why his regime is bad. He's just a bad person.
We base our assumptions or our conviction that he's bad
So
because of his
assuming,
violation.
so you're admitting that you're assuming a bunch of your points, correct?
I said our conviction. Oh, so you're saying that he wasn't corrupt? That it's an assumption?
No, he was corrupt because he was
Okay,
bad,
anyways,
not because of national security.
one more thing. We need, in terms of terrorists, when we're torturing terrorists for information, is torture legal in the United States?
Right now, we believe that's in a somewhat of a limbo, as we
It's-
constantly debate about on debate.
Okay, yes. So, in terms of violating national security, in terms of national security, is it legal to torture terrorists for
We
information?
didn't violate national security. I don't know what you're talking about. We
Okay,
actually
I'll just move on to another question. Okay, back to the example you guys provided regarding, do we need Korean men to serve in the army to have national security, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so which do you value more, national security or having Korean men serve in the army?
Well, can I answer this question? Well, if North Korea's boots came out of nowhere and entered my door, I would rather serve in the military and proudly serve my
But
country.
because you value national security.
I think you guys want the rest of your time? Yes.
I think one conclusion that both affirmative, negative audience judges can all agree is that this is a values debate. That we're pretty much debating the ideas of one concept and the concept of another. So, having said that, I want to talk about the burdens for a bit here, the burdens of each side, because it has been something that has been quite confusing, and we want to clarify that before we move on to the voters issue. So very quickly, we have the burden as the affirmative to prove that whenever there's a conflict between national security and individual liberties, that individual liberties should be preferred. The negative has the burden to prove that whenever there's a conflict between national security and individual liberty, national security must be preferred. I think that's a very simple burden. Now, having said that, I think there are limits and there are absolutes, that we shouldn't be arguing absolutes. That one side does not have the burden to take one extreme stance, and the other side has to take another extreme stance. That's not what we're saying. We have to compare the values and see which one is better than others. Now, having said that, second negative speaker comes up here and says it's not about precedence, it's not about what comes first. We agree. It's about what ensures what, and that's true too. And he says that national security ensures individual liberties, and which comes to my first voters issue about what's more important depending on precedence and the ensuring of the value. If national security ensures individual liberty, why would we need national security if there is no individual liberty? National security, according to the negative, was created to protect individual rights. If individual rights don't exist, then national security has no purpose. The very sole purpose which ensures individual liberties is national security, and therefore for the negative to come up here and say that national security is somehow better than the very thing that it's supposed to protect is completely flawed. Now let me give you a more concrete example of this. Now, we've been talking about about national security and how it differs between nations. Each nation has a different interpretation of national security. That's why, for example, Korea decides to have a forced draft that every single male of age needs to go to the draft. Unlike, for example, other countries that don't have that. There are different interpretations of national security. But the interpretation that the negative is trying to propose is the very thing that creates nations like North Korea or Cuba, where we value national security over individual liberties, where we think that national security is more important than the very thing it was created to protect. Once we start forgetting about the role of individual liberties, then the purpose becomes actually counterproductive to what we want to protect. Which is why countries like Cuba or North Korea or all these other regimes of totalitarianism, communism, dictatorships, etc. are violating individual rights because of the fact that they decided to disregard individual liberties when national security was created in the first place to protect them. Now, having said that, I want to talk about the second voters issue, which is the idea of this no right to absolute argument. That I think we've come to the conclusion that nothing is absolute. National defense and security is not absolute. Individual rights is not absolute, which is why we're here debating today. But one question that has not been answered and we need to be answered is this: if there's a terrorist and we decided to torture him, and let's say it didn't work, and okay, for the assumption that we're allowed to torture him because the terrorist tried to kill someone and therefore he gave up his rights, let's just assume that. So yes, let's say that we torture him for the sake of national security. But what if that does not work? Do we then torture his family, his friends, anyone who can know more about his information? Or do we torture his mother so that the terrorist can decide to speak up and say things to see his mother in pain? The negative does have the burden, like I said, to prove that this isn't right, that we're allowed to do this as a value, that the United States and other countries that have legitimacy are allowed to do this. Because as I just stated, and as I think we've all agreed, the negative has the burden to prove that when in conflict with national security and individual liberty, that national security should come first. And in the situation where a terrorist does not reveal information important to national security, then there's still other options that we can take, but those options would be violating individual liberties. And this is the type of action, the very action that countries like North Korea and Cuba are doing, that when they're not able to get information from an individual that they needed, then they start torturing their family, their dad, their mom, their brothers, their sisters, their sons, their daughters, until the terrorist decides to speak up, because the countries like those do not have an appreciation for individual liberty and only focus on national liberty. So I think what can come to the conclusion of this debate is this: we need to compromise. That's something that's obviously true, that there is no such thing as absolutes in any war. But what has to be ensured is that national security does not exist without the presence of individual liberties, and it's not favored more than that. Because, as the affirmative has proven, if you start focusing on national security and decide to get rid of the very reason that national security was created, as the second negative speaker has said, the very reason was because it ensures individual liberties. So if you decide to forget and decide that the thing that you're supposed to protect is less important than the protection itself, then you decide to disregard and you're using the wrong tool for the wrong motives. And for this reason, we strongly urge you to vote in favor of the affirmative. Thank you.
Wow, it's really hot here. But then, if I start running around naked right now at this moment, try stripping off my clothes and then run around across the street, people just don't say, "Oh, thank you for ensuring you're upholding your liberties." They put me in a nut house. We say because rights aren't absolute, and because we say that national security ensures the protection of civil liberties, we say the opposition has taken this debate home. Now, with that said, I'd like to examine this debate in two clashes. Number one, I'm going to examine what exactly is national security, and what is the type of national security we're trying to protect. Second of all, which ensures the other? Is it national security that protects individual rights, or the individual rights that protects national security? We need to find those two clashes in today's debate. Now I'm going to start answering our first clash, which is about what exactly is national security. Now, in the first cross-examination, when I asked the first speaker of the proposition side, I asked about self-defense. I asked if a criminal holds a gun to my head, am I allowed to trigger that gun as well? They said yes. In the case of self-defense, you're allowed to do so and take away that right of that certain individual. Now, their definition, one of the parts of the definition of national security was self-defense. And when we talked about this in their idea and our rebuttals, they came up and said, well, it's only an idea. Well, I don't know what to say about that. They only tried to dilute the argument and say it's only an idea, and basically, because it's a value debate, we shouldn't talk about these things. Now, second of all, we say when they believe it's a value debate and try to say we need to measure the values, it's pretty weird for them to bring up realistic situations. In the first speaker, they mentioned we need to live in the real world where there are countries such as North Korea and Cuba trying to destroy other countries because of their national security. Well, first of all, we like to say that they disregarded all our arguments and all our examples on the points of rational states. Rational states that really fit the definition of this motion and really fit the spirit of this motion, ladies and gentlemen. We say in the case of Cuba and North Korea, the problem with Cuba and North Korea is that the violations of international laws of international security is being violated by North Korea and Cuba. Therefore, we say it's irrelevant to talk about this in this debate today. And they also have denied or ignored all of the arguments that we made about how rational states have a check and balance system, ladies and gentlemen. Rational states have a check and balance system in order to prevent the abuse of national security. Because they want to ensure civil liberties, liberties, they take place in, they give you national security. In this case, we say that they completely disregarded this fact. Because they failed to engage in this fact, we take this clash. So we told you about the UN Declaration of Human Rights, right? About how in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Article 29, Section 2, it talks about the ways how people's rights can be violated. And they agreed to us that in these cases, people's rights can be violated. So what exactly is it? Rights are absolute or not? So first of all, when they asked in the cross-examination whether rights were absolute or not, they said, yes, rights are absolute. But when they talked about securing self-defense, they said, well, sometimes they're not absolute, but they are absolute. So we say, in this case, they didn't have a clear line or clear stance defining what their rights were and what kind of rights they were protecting. So we say in this case was a fundamental error made by the proposition side. Now, to move on to a second clash, which ensures the other when it comes to national security and national security and individual rights. Now, we told you in today's second speech and first speech that if we don't have national security, we don't have civil rights. We talk, let's give you an example. We say if we don't have national security, we'll only see people like my coach there only that drinks vodka around the street, running around naked, maybe shooting someone if they feel like it. We say if national security doesn't exist, there is no law enforcement, there is no civil liberty, ladies and gentlemen. We've shown you clearly that it doesn't exist without the other. We say in this case that they failed to actually engage in this point as well. So we say if you don't have national security, how the hell are you going to ensure these civil rights? Are you going to just let these, or believe in these people? Like, you have civil rights, if you want to keep them, you can do whatever you want, but please don't harm these people. We say that's not the point. We say that the government is there to protect its people, to protect what they're fighting for. And when they say in this case, we mentioned several examples of how it is done, because we have national security, we have civil rights. Therefore, because national security ensures the rights of others, it's actually absolute. That was when the second speaker, the third speaker of their side, asked our first speaker, saying whether or not national security is absolute or not. Yes, we do agree. National security is absolute because without that, we don't have civil liberties, we don't have life. So basically, we say in this case that we say that while national security is absolute, rights aren't absolute because of the fact that they can be devalued when it comes to the case of protecting other people, protecting national security. Therefore, we say actually, national security ensures civil liberty. So basically in today's debate, we told you that number one, national security doesn't only talk about these rogue states, these communist states who have odd leaders that they talked about. We've given you the justification that you can't talk about this because it goes against international law and international security. So therefore we say that the argument was invalid in that state. And because they failed to engage in the point of how rational states prevent this from happening, we strongly beg to oppose. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.